So welcome everybody to today's episode of the Independent Teacher podcast, and I'm really pleased that it's our first episode of season 4 and I'm joined by Andrew Rogers. Andrew, welcome to today's show.
Well, thanks for having me, Susan. It's a pleasure to be able to talk to you.
And you may be able to tell from Andrew's accent that Andrew isn't based in the UK. Do you want to tell us a little bit about where you are at the moment, Andrew?
Yeah, I'm currently in Perth in Western Australia. I'm just sitting in my classroom at the end of a day's teaching. So it's the early afternoon here and early in the morning for you, Susan. So a bit of a time difference going on. So I've been in Australia for 10 years now, as of 2 weeks ago. And I currently work in we call it K-12 school over here. So, all the way down from the very kindies right through to our senior students at year 12. And I'm a teacher of religion, philosophy and ethics, and loving my time over here in Western Australia. Prior to being here, I was working in Wiltshire, a small country town called Devizes, and I was there for 13 years, really, from the start of my teaching career right through. So I grew really into the role, just started as an NQT and then, picked up, bits of responsibility and finished up as a head of faculty there before we made the move to Australia back in 2013. So, yeah, it's been in the classroom for just coming up to, must be 23 years now. And it's incredible to think where that time's disappeared to.
Well, we are going to explore a little bit later on in the programme about moving to Australia from the UK and teaching in Australia and the Australian education system. But before we do that, I just want to ask you about this lovely award that you won in 2021. Could you just tell us about that?
Yeah, it took me totally by surprise, actually, but I was awarded the Australian Teacher of the Year award in the secondary non-government category at the Australian Education Awards. So that was, a huge surprise for the start, but then I didn't quite realise just what a big award it actually was at the time. And I think as time's gone on, it's really become clear that was quite a big deal as far as it all went. So yeah, I was nominated for the award by one of my senior leaders at my previous school, and she approached me in the playground one day and said, "Look, hope you don't mind, but I've nominated you for this award." And I laughed at her and I said, "Well, okay, fair enough. If you think it's got legs, then good luck. But I'm not expecting anything at all to come from it." But a few months later, I got an email saying I've been shortlisted for the award. And then they asked us to put together a bit of a portfolio about all the things I've been doing over the last year. And then they invited us to a big posh awards ceremony in Sydney, at Darling Harbour. So, those of your listeners who know Sydney will know that's, one of the very swanky ends of Sydney. But unfortunately, that was right at the time of COVID, and the awards ceremony was sadly cancelled. And the ceremony was done online. So there I was sitting in my living room, watching this live streaming awards ceremony. And yeah, they called my name out. So yeah, it's really quite, career highlight, undoubtedly. Huge surprise. And it's just been, really interesting just to see the reaction to that as well, which has just been great.
Brilliant. Now, what I want to do, Andrew, is just talk about philosophy. Why do you think it's so important in the curriculum? And here's the question. Do you think it equips pupils in our ever-changing 21st century world? Because there's so much conversation at the moment about the curriculum and whether really it's serving the needs of our pupils in this fast-paced, fast-changing world. Where does philosophy fit in?
I've got a very strong investment, but my feeling is that I don't think you'll find a more important subject at the moment to fit into any school curriculum, any national curriculum, just because of the skills which it underpins. So, I look at the world where we live today. We're on the verge of very, very strange yet scary and exciting things to occur. Very uncertain times, and what philosophy does is it teaches students to think. It ultimately teaches them to be able to come up with arguments for their positions, and it teaches them to be able to engage with the positions and the justifications of others. So if you're looking for a subject that will really equip a student for any eventuality that's going to come in the future. You really don't need to look any further than philosophy at all. It's interesting when I've just been doing a subject selection pitch for my students as they take on their public examination courses next academic year, and I've been doing it through the forum of future skills, and I've had a look at the World Economic Forum, and they seemingly put out every year or so their top 10 skills of the future that employers are looking for. And the last one they did, they put out 10 skills that they felt were the most vital, most important ones for employers to be looking for. And 8 of those skills are found integral to philosophy. The only 2 that aren't were the digital tech ones. But, I could make an argument there as well to say that actually what philosophy does in the world of AI is really teaches students to be able to critically engage with AI and be able to differentiate from appropriate use, not appropriate use, and issues like that. So, the skills that the Economic Forum puts up there are things like analytic thinking, active learning, and the way I teach philosophy is extremely active. I might talk about that a bit more in a moment. Complex problem solving, critical thinking, creativity and originality, leadership, resilience, and reason and problem solving. So, those 8 skills are fundamental to the subject. And I think that if you're looking for future skills for any future society, that's going to be the one place I'd be looking in terms of what you need to be addressing.
And is it compulsory in Australia that students have to follow a course in philosophy? And I know you mentioned religion there as well.
Yeah. Well, look, I would like it to be, but sadly it's not. I'm teaching in a public school, or an independent school, I think you'd call it, in the UK. And we are very fortunate to be able to offer courses of study in philosophy and ethics to our students. Not many schools do. It's not part of the national curriculum. So it really is, something a bit niche, I suppose, something a little bit different. But I'm really sensing a groundswell, moving towards this style of education. The pedagogy I use to deliver it is extremely learner focused, extremely interactive, with the students getting involved in their own learning and agency as well. And everybody I speak to, in the educational fields, no matter what subject area they're in, is really coming to recognise the value and the importance of studying a course in philosophy and critical thinking.
Do you have to be careful when you're having discussions, say, about migration or inclusion and diversity and climate change? Do you have to take care in terms of what happens in the classroom and what is said in the classroom and what you say to the students in the classroom?
I think you've asked a very, very powerful question. And I think, there are many educators who are extremely worried about bringing these sorts of questions to their students, knowing the wide breadth of opinion, certainly knowing the nature of divisive nature, certainly about those issues. I think anybody would be right to treat those with caution. Where I think philosophy does well, I've got to be clear here, that the pedagogical approach I use is that really of what they call P4C. In the UK, it's philosophy for children. Over in Australia, we call it philosophy in schools. But the approach there is very, very student centered, but it's done with very, very clear parameters and very, very clear rules. The idea is that the students take ownership of the session. The teacher in my role really becomes a facilitator rather than an actual teacher. And it's all about, using, Socrates' phrase, to become a midwife for ideas. You're helping the students to give birth to their own thoughts. And to be able to do that, you need to provide a safe space for that to occur. And the underpinning value is obviously respect and respectful dialogue. So with issues like those are the really what I would call deep, rich issues that I would be absolutely looking for to encourage my students to talk about. I certainly find when I do raise those issues in my classroom, the students are, quite excited because they never normally get a chance to talk about them. They often find themselves shut down. So I think it's refreshing that they get given the opportunity to share them. But the way we run things is we run them through that respectful lens. So it's not just a free forum, where everyone stands on their soapbox and yells their ideas and, shouts insults at everybody else. it's all about being able to put your ideas, forward in a meaningful way. So, we teach the skills of argumentation. We teach the students what makes for a good reasoned argument, through the use of evidence and through the use of making inferences, to create an argument that holds together. And then we teach them how to critique that. And so, my ultimate aim is that we do end up, certainly at the beginning at least, in some form of disagreement, and then we try and tease out where those areas of disagreement are. Is it about some of the opinions that we've heard our dad say, or something we've seen on the TV, or is it something that we might have read in a newspaper, and then we try and tease them through and try and work out, well, is that rational to hold that perspective? Does it fit with our life experience? Does it fit with our understanding of how the world really is? And so we teach respectful challenge, where students are able to disagree with someone in their classroom, in their peer group and in their classroom, but to do so in a way that doesn't offend the other person. And so it really does become a great place for challenging assumptions. It becomes a real meaningful place for engaging with ideas, and really trying to find out where the ideas are strongest. And in true, I guess, scientific way is following the evidence where it might lead. And a lot of the time, it forces the children to change their mind, or the young people to change their mind. And that's one of the most powerful things at the end of every lesson, where a student says, I've actually changed my mind from where I thought I was at the start to where I am now. So, those big ideas that you were talking about, the idea of environments and climate change and migration, those big divisive issues, I revel in them. And I think they're really exciting, certainly from my experience. Young people are quite astute. It's all about trying to give them a platform, but equally an opportunity to meaningfully engage, not just be told, here are the school's values or here are society's values, and to try and work those ideas out for themselves. And I think that really speaks to, the previous question you were talking about before, about why it's so important, certainly in the future environment with which we find ourselves, because social media being as it is, it's very much in an echo chamber. If you're not careful, the only ideas you'll hear are those ideas that you agree with. It's not real life, though. We're going to come into contact with people we disagree with. We're going to come into contact with people who we, fundamentally oppose, and it's trying to understand their position, and being open to the idea of, perhaps I wasn't quite as right as I thought I perhaps once was. So it's quite empowering, actually, to get to that point.
I can see why you would fall in love with philosophy, the way you've put it there. Do you think teachers in Australia have the autonomy that they need in order to function effectively in the classroom? Can they teach what they want and how they want?
It's very similar to the UK, actually, in terms of, the curriculum. Australia does have a national curriculum, which is, implemented in schools. But equally, we've got a very diverse group of states, so we've got a number of different states and territories, and each state has got its own education department, which again will then legislate again on the curriculum with which they want the schools to be following. So, in terms of that, you've obviously got your fundamental basics that you have to teach. Some schools will, like mine, decide, okay, we're going to add extras on top of those. And, I guess you're limited to that degree. But where I've tried to, move things along a little bit more than that is, part of my teaching load here is also to teach humanities. We call it humanities and social sciences. So, history, geography, economics, civics and citizenship. And I've been trying to use my philosophy pedagogy in those areas as well. So, I guess to come to your question, we are pedagogically free, if that makes any sense. But in terms of the topics, we there are a lot of them that are, fairly obviously quite mandated. So to give you an example, in our history curriculum, like I think many history curriculums, across the Western world, we look at the Second World War. And with my, philosophy lens, I'm looking for those areas of contention. So, rather than just teaching, what happened in the war, I'm looking at it through an ethical lens, and trying to say, well, is war the right approach here? Was the use of the atomic bomb justifiable? And then teasing out, the different perspectives and different ways of looking at that. It's really enhancing to certainly my classroom to take that sort of approach, because quite traditionally, I guess, you've got a textbook and you follow what the textbook says and you take it away and you learn it by rote and you write it down in the exam. But I think the philosophical approach just allows students to go much wider, much deeper, to follow their areas of interest, whereas still following the topics, I suppose, that are mandated by the state and federally as well in the national government.
Is there too much assessment in Australia?
I think there's a real sense in any education system of accountability. It seems as though if we can't produce a number or a level to put up for someone to measure, then something's not worth doing. And I find that quite restricting, again, in terms of what we do. I find that the best learning takes place in students when assessments aren't there. And again, it's this deep learning that can really, empower a student that I think gets lost a lot of the time, because, we've got this mandated series of syllabus dot points we've got to do. Why have we got to do them? Because they're on the exam. Or why have we got to do the exam? Because that's how the school's judged and measured and the results put in the newspaper, and, so on the wheel goes. So I think like anywhere, I don't like the amount of assessment we do. Certainly given, I think my preferences, I will just reduce them dramatically. I think it drives education, and I think that's a mistake. I think that what should be driving education is engaging of students in deep learning, but it seems to be very, very surface level. And again, I think most of the assessments are turning increasingly more into memory tests. Which, again, coming back to the future skills, is becoming increasingly redundant. I mean, why do we need students with good memories? We just go to Google, type it in, 5 seconds later, there's your answer. So all these kids who are developing all these great memories, that's brilliant. But what are they going to do? What we really need are these students who can, think critically, creatively, and, problem solve. And those are the sorts of things I think that get forgotten when we're so set on assessments and tests and, public accountability, rather than engaging in where the students really are.
So is teaching then an attractive profession in Australia to graduates?
That's a good question. Look, I've been reading with interest about the teacher shortage in the UK, and it's really started to creep in over here as well. I certainly know at the start of this academic year, which was back in January, governments were getting very concerned. They were starting to put together national teacher workforce action plans, to attract more people into the classrooms and into the workplace. It's a difficult profession. It's a difficult profession, I think, no matter where you are. Financially, there's not as much reward as there would be in, the accounting, financial, banking sector, IT even. There's very, very long hours, so it requires a lot of commitment to do. The expectations seem to be almost unrelenting, I think. Because not only are you responsible for, educating your classes, but, there's a lot of pastoral care that comes along with that as well. So that obviously leads to burnout if it's not very carefully managed. And again, not at my school, but I know in, many other schools that, there's a lot of the teachers struggle with a lack of respect they're shown from the students. And again, that can only be damaging too. So I think, to echo what's happening in the UK, it's certainly got a few issues in Australia, and it's requiring a lot of creative thinking from governments to know what to do to attract teachers back to the classroom, to retain them. Again, the figures I think in Australia are very similar to the UK. There's large numbers leaving after the first 2, 3, 5 years in the profession. People like me who've been doing it for over 20 years, I think, are becoming more and more rare. It's increasingly becoming a very difficult, challenging profession, I think. So look, as far as my position is concerned, I love my job, and I'm very fortunate. Coming to school is a real joy for me. We've got a very good lifestyle here in Australia, and I think that might help. Because the weather's obviously a lot better. There's opportunities to do other things at the weekends. You're not spending the whole time working. I love it. I mean, but then I also can recognize that it's not for everybody. And you can certainly see, when, young graduates come through, or, people are restless, they're unhappy. And, inevitably you see them leaving, which is, it's desperately sad, I think. Thinking back to when I started the profession, 20 odd years ago, it was a different world. Your free periods literally were your free periods. I mean, you could actually spend them, in the staff room reading the newspaper or talking to your colleagues. And it does seem now that when you do get a free period, you're, immersed in work, trying to stay upright. So it's a difficult question. It should be the best job in the world.
Is it because there's too much accountability?
I think the accountability is very interesting. I mean, certainly when I started, there was no Ofsted. And, I know that's a real stressor. I mean, I'm fortunate to have, 3 Ofsted cycles when I was in the UK. And, I know how under the pump that puts you. And from what I'm led to believe, they seem to be coming, around a lot faster than they used to. They seem to be a lot more in depth than they used to. Schools obviously have got to be accountable for what they do, and if they're not, then that triggers another inspection, and off come the government inspectors coming around again. So that's got to be a huge factor. I think people are always now concerned about the public face is probably the wrong word, but are they doing the right thing? Are they meeting the standards that have been set down? To look at it from another angle, if you are, in a government and you are tasked with raising standards, how do you do it? Because, you've got to have something that's measurable. But I would certainly argue, like you would, that there has to be a way to make things measurable, to be accountable without putting what I would say is your biggest asset under the pressures that they currently find themselves. Because that seems to be undeniably the problem. There's too much pressure being applied, and they're not being given perhaps the necessary support they need to be able to do their job and do their job well. Because I think every teacher wants to become a good educator. I think that's why we go into the profession. We care about the young people. We want to see them grow. We want to see them succeed. And I think maybe, sometimes goodwill is taken advantage of. I think there's always been the expectation that, teachers will just do it because, they're good people and that's what they're in the job to do. But you wouldn't necessarily find that in any other profession. I'm just wondering about, the financial incentives that you find in the banking industry that, are put there. Yes, there's an incentive. I was in the UK when they brought in performance-related pay, and that was awful. That was a huge stressor in terms of where that, led us, because it, added extra level of worry and concern. And again, these were things outside your control, and you had to justify everything. If a student wasn't in school for, number of weeks and their grade slipping, well, what are you going to do about it? And the finger was very much pointed firmly on you when, these were factors outside of your control, perhaps. The accountability thing you're talking about is very significant. But it's difficult to know what to do because, that's unfortunately the world we live in. I suppose as a teacher, what you want to be doing is to be trusted. You're not there to take advantage of the situation. I don't know a single teacher that does. You're there because you care passionately about your role and you want the young people to be given the best opportunities with which they have. But it seems as though you're not trusted because there's always somebody looking over your shoulder trying to, get your graph to move upwards in a more meaningful way. But, young people aren't graphs. They're complex, emotion-led young people who, again, they want to do well for themselves too. So, the current system, I think, is really not doing what it needs to do. I think it's driving up the wrong things. It's putting the emphasis very much on data. It's putting the emphasis very much on individual, performance. When really, as a teacher, it's a soft skill. You can't measure, empathy and compassion and inspiration, because that's what ultimately the best teachers do. They inspire their teachers to go and look for themselves, and you can't measure that.
I'm going to come on to you, Andrew, now. If you were to go back in time and give one piece of advice to your younger self, as you embarked on your teaching career, what would that be?
I think my advice would be just to have courage to follow your intuition. Have the courage to express yourself the way you feel as though you need to. Because again, coming back to your question from earlier, I think teachers are almost forced to stay within a certain mold or a certain parameter. And a lot of people don't like being limited and shut down. And I know certainly in my early career, I felt, very pained that I was being driven down a road that I didn't necessarily want to go down. We're following this exam-led society, and I've learned throughout my career that there are other ways to get success in those fields than just following the same track that everybody else has done before you. A lot of the success in my career has come through taking risks, from doing things unexpected, trusting the students to, go off piste a little bit, to go a bit wider, to, and again, in my own pedagogy, to radically get rid of the desks. We don't need them. They restrict us. They get in the way. Get rid of the laptops. Kids hide behind them. Just to really get them open to sharing ideas. So yeah, my advice would certainly just be, don't be forced into conformity. My earliest mentor, actually, when I was a very raw, very green, newly qualified teacher, described himself as a maverick. And at the time, I was a little bit, I don't want to be like that. But looking back, that was the best thing I could possibly have been. Not to be, totally anarchistic about it and reject the rules and do everything else, but to have the real courage to understand what makes students tick and to exploit that, not to be followed by the institution that drives you down a certain pathway. So yeah, my advice would be, don't be forced into conformity. Be radical. Be a maverick.
So finally, as we come to the end of our conversation, looking forward rather than looking backwards, what do you think the education system will be like in the next 20 years?
I've got two answers to that question. One of them is what I hope it will be like, and the second response is what I fear it will be like. So the optimistic side of me is hoping for a place that fosters this independent thought and creative learning, that empowers the young people to think for themselves, driven by curiosity, driven by creativity, where every individual student is recognized and empowered rather than restricted. Obviously, AI is going to play a huge factor. I was reflecting on this today, looking back at my earliest days, and there was still a chalkboard. We had one computer in the department. We still had the OHP on that biscuit tin, scenario. So, 20 years hence, here we are, when we've got, laptop devices in every classroom. We've got ChatGPT that's, either being used or exploited, depending on your perspective. So I think, to be realistic, AI will play a part. But I hope it's a place where AI is used to enhance learning and not to replace it. I hope it's a place where we can see the benefits of AI to enable students to develop their creativity through it, to be able to learn how to use it and to use it in a way that will enhance them. Ultimately, I want it to be a place where students can become the better versions of themselves. It's very Aristotelian in its way. When we do that, it'll lead to a better society. So that's what I hope the education system will become. My fear is that it's going to continue in a vein where it becomes assessment-driven, performance-based, data-led, this prescribed mold, where it's all about being accountable to the outside world rather than really what's going on. I think it's going to take a very brave government to ultimately move away from that. But if you look around the world and you see the education systems that are doing well, places like Finland, they're following the model which will fit my hopes, where they do things radically, they do things differently, they do remove desks, they don't force kids into tests from age 7 and upwards, and force them into this box of regimented learning, and they're reaping the benefits. And I think it would take a very brave government to do it, but I think if we don't, I think we're on the verge of destroying our education system altogether, because the teacher burnout that's being accompanied in the recruitment crisis with this current model is just not sustainable. So I think we do need to be radical. I think we do need to be brave, and I think we do need to embrace new ideas that might seem a little bit crazy to start with, but ultimately, if they're rooted in the right ways, as a place to develop student curiosity, to enhance their creative thinking, their critical thinking, I think we're going to be onto a winner.
Andrew, it's been absolutely brilliant catching up with you today. So many things we've talked about there, and we could come back to them and discuss them in a lot more detail, but it's been such a worthwhile conversation. So thank you ever so much for joining us.
Well, no, thank you for having me. It's just been thoroughly enjoyable all round. So thank you.
Thank you.
You have been listening to the Independent Teacher podcast. If you like listening to this podcast, please consider giving us a 5-star rating either on Spotify or Apple Podcasts.